going to move on to our first speaker and a fireside discussion with Bob Booth, Transformation Lead for Finance and Supply Chain for IBM in the UK.
Thanks, Blaise.
Good morning.
Morning.
So we've already had a bit of an intro discussion to each other. From army trucks to a boat, Guy's and St. Thomas's supply chain journey. Oh no, this is the wrong speech they put up. Well, anyway, we had mitigating the risk of transformation with people at the heart.
Yeah.
Let's start though with some of your own personal background.
Yeah, so Bob Booth, I'm responsible for supply chain and finance transformation in IBM's business. And I spent the last 25 years working with clients in all sorts of kind of sectors, whether it be consumer or actually defense or hospitals, helping them to sort of design and deliver transformation journeys with all aspects of that, whether it be the technology, operating model, data, AI, all those components.
Brilliant. Can you give me an indication of, we're going to go over how we don't design processes anymore and we go into experiences, but first, Brexit, COVID, Ukraine. So 3 key events / ongoing events. How have they affected and how have they affected the future? I think starting with Brexit.
Yeah, so I guess all of our world's been turned upside down. It's kind of hard to discuss that, right, sitting in London compared to what people in Ukraine are facing. But all of our world's been turned upside down. Yeah? So I guess if you go back 10 years ago, and we're having a conversation about savings declaration and procurement, we were talking about cost reduction. But that's kind of gone away over the course of the last 10 years, and it's been much more about, how can the procurement department, supply chain department do the basics, right, i.e. deliver savings, but then do far more than that. But, Brexit, and then Brexit immediately compounded by COVID, kind of threw everything away, right? So it sort of changed the dynamic. It meant that we had to really focus on supply surety, understand our supply chain. It also meant that our businesses need to become much more agile and dynamic. So as well as running the business, you're running the business with more constraints in terms of lack of people, and also kind of extra things to do, we also had to transform the business. So those things changed the way that we supply chain leads and procurement leaders functioned, and that kind of took us to kind of 12 months ago. If I then compound kind of what Ukraine has done, a couple of things really. I guess firstly it's further compounded the surety of supply, certainly for my clients in areas like hospitality. A vast proportion of the European wheat production in Russia and Ukraine, along with all the various different components generated. It's made supply surety a really bigger problem, but also then kind of inflation's now become a huge topic. So we have to be able to find a way of mitigating costs whilst also trying to drive things. So our responsibilities in supply chain and procurement are further compounded. We have more to do, but we still need to be more agile. Yeah. So those kind of features have made the world, in many ways, kind of far bigger again. It became much smaller, and it's far bigger again.
There are 3 or 4 things that you've touched on there that are pretty much of crucial importance to everyone. But before we move too far away from it, are you able to give us a bit of color, perhaps for those who don't know, about Ukraine's position in grain production, especially? Yeah,
so there's the something like 30% of grain for Europe is produced in Ukraine. A whole bunch of the rest is produced in Russia, and now kind of part of that supply has been removed, and then obviously embargoes and sanctions mean we can't get the remainder. So that's going to materially affect the supply. It's also obviously the price of grain's gone up by something like 20% in the last 3 or 4 months. So that's just kind of picked on one component. You then kind of pile on with that what might happen for example, in terms of 20% of Skoda's parts come from Ukraine, so the VAG group. So there are really material impacts in terms of supply security and price from the conflict.
Now rewinding a bit to the beginning to 2020, about this point in 2020, what was the conversation around agility like with your clients?
Yeah, I guess our theme was we were really meeting them where they were. Yeah, so depending on indeed which industry they were in, they were faced by really kind of fundamentally different situations. At that point, I'd just started a journey with the hospitality business. We'd been sort of scaling and planning their kind of people-centric transformation program for the kind of the whole business. And then 3 months into that process, COVID hit. and their sales reduced by 50% in Europe. Yeah? So, you know, really, really radical and dramatic. And so then we had to think differently about, you know, how are we going to still get the same piece done with a different set of people and different set of talent. Another company, for example, a snacks company in the US, they were producing biscuits, and they were trying to work out whether or not they could pack single packs to go to mom and pop shops, or whether they needed to put multi-packs on the shelves of supermarkets. You know? So through that, we're able to work with them, understand the demand from their customers, forecast the impact on which stores were going to be open and closed based upon school shortages, based upon forecast COVID numbers, and help them make sure they got the right products in place, both in terms of what was being manufactured, by understanding visibility from customer all the way through to supply chain. And it was almost like that was a little acorn, right? That individual digital initiative that was stood up in over a weekend became then something that then had to be flourished and had to be scaled. Yeah? So depending on where they were, then the urgency changed, but the dynamic was really about, you know, back to how can we run the business, but at the same time, how can we scale the business and transform? So
adapting to situations and I guess having adaptive relationships and new relationships, that's something that we touched on. Would you mind kind of expanding on how do you change people's behavior to, let's say, a supply chain or a procurement system that has been in place for as long as they've been around?
Yeah, I guess if you're thinking about then how do you get people to behave differently, how do you drive transformation? I think there are a couple of dynamics really. I mean, firstly, and we're talking particularly around indirect procurement, we have to get people to want to do things differently. You know, fundamentally, everyone thinks they're a shopper, right? We're all the kings of Amazon. My Amazon parcel turns up and I wonder what I bought, right? So I'm such a prolific shopper. I won't talk about the sustainability impact of all the cardboard at this stage, right? But everyone thinks they're a shopper. So we, as the procurement lead, need to get the business to get them to want to follow policy. We need to get them to want to enter into our systems, pick our particular suppliers, and that's really a journey about communication and change. At the same time, the systems we're trying to use are kind of, you know, they're based upon the empire system of requisitioning, right? You're kind of almost like you go to the quartermaster and say, can I have a tent? Because my tent's got a hole in it, right? So our requisitioning system is really based upon something of the empire. You fill in a form, you write down what you want, they give you one, and you walk out again. So modern systems aren't really designed, procurement systems aren't really designed to allow people to deal with some of the dynamic elements of supply, such as services. So what we believe is that you really need to put people at the heart of all that, right? You need to understand what their experiences are, what their needs are, what their pain points are, and then design an experience that makes it easy for them, kind of almost Amazon-like, if you like, to be able to buy what you need to be able to buy. So it's really about putting yourself in their shoes and then making it easy to be compliant and then difficult to be non-compliant.
There's a proliferation of companies that are offering this, basically. Relationships at the center and designing an experience that makes it really easy for supply chain procurement professionals to find that. Do you think that this is something that every single consultancy or major firm is going to have to do, or do you think it's just a question of plugging and play?
Well, I think it's not just consultancy. I think everyone needs to think it through. So if you go back to the Amazon example, one of the reasons why they were successful was every meeting with 5 people, they had a 6th chair, and the 6th chair represented the customer, right? So they were obsessed with experience. They were thinking about what's the customer journey. So I think everyone that's going to be successful, that wants to get people to behave in a different way, need to drive this dynamic. I think the challenge is actually, how do you do that in a corporate world? So if I'm the CPO or the Chief Supply Chain Officer, he or she trying to sort of drive that, how am I successfully making that work, right? So we've already talked about the dynamics in supply chain and procurement. You know, we've got this massive challenge in terms of cost reduction, massive challenge in terms of surety of supply, real challenge in terms of war for talent. Every other department's facing the same challenge, right? So marketing, sales, operations, finance have all got the same challenge. IT are sort of trying to work out how to, you know, not spend $1 billion upgrading their SAP system again, right? So there are so many, and most organizations are on SAP. Most organizations are journeying to S4 eventually. How do you make all those things work? And I think the biggest challenge to do all that is to drive consensus, right? To get everyone to agree, what are the priorities? What do we need to do? What do we not need to do? And I quite like the Oscar Wilde quote, which says that if everyone agrees with me, I must be wrong. Yeah, so actually the really hard thing is to get everyone to agree we are going to do these things and we're going to put our heart and soul into them, and we're not going to do those things. I think that's the challenge.
How do you get people coming together on the same page? It's easy, when you just say it in practice and put it out there, but when you're trying to bring in all the stakeholders, not only in the value chain, just within a corporate, how do you do that? How do you propose that people go home and then try to actually enact it?
Yeah, well, I'll answer that in two parts, I guess. So I'll talk about everything else, and then I'll talk about the journey around sustainability. I think sustainability is our great hope for making the world small again. So I'll come on to talk about that. But business as usual. I think you have to do, if you like, change is designed from the top, and the concept comes from the top and then delivered from the grassroots, right? Where I spend a lot of my time working day to day. So you have to find a way to engage with the senior team, the board, and have them completely aligned around what's our priorities. And then at the same time, have the operational teams bought into and doing the work. And so the way we do that is through two parts. So by thinking through the appropriate part of the business, what are the business capabilities that are really critical and differentiated, right? So for a supply chain business, there's something around supply chain visibility, something around should cost modeling, particularly now, something around supply demand planning. What are the 4 or 5 things? Something definitely around sustainability. What are the 5 things that we at the functional level between IT, finance, supply chain, procurement in our area completely agree on the priorities, and that sets, if you like, the North Star around the transformation vision. Because it means in those areas, we're going to really invest in differentiated capabilities. We're going to modernize the experience. We're going to modernize the systems. We're going to modernize the data. We're going to modernize the experience that everyone faces. And everywhere else, maybe it's the accounts payable function or the cash application function, we're just going to use standard. So that allows us to say, here are the priorities, here are the dynamics. But then it really hits the road by using conventional design thinking techniques to understand who are the personas, who are the people on the ground, the operational leaders, the factory managers that have to do this work. And by working with them through a persona journey, understanding what their pain points are, understanding what the difficulties. Actually, when I'm in the factory, the scanner, I can't scan the barcode properly because if A, B, and C happens, if I haven't got connectivity or the label's not printed on properly. Because by solving all those day-to-day problems, you solve all those day-to-day problems, then you're in a position to be able to provide all the initiatives that need to be able to happen, stacked up, bottom up, to be able to deliver the long-term vision. And those two things combined, constantly reminding people, because actually the world change, here are the critical priorities, allow you to deliver the initiative, deliver the transformation programs in parallel with running the business. Because what it does allow you to do is to say, here's the quick wins, right? We know we're going to change the way we print the barcode scanners, for example, the barcode tickets. This is stuff that the teams can do day to day. We know what we can do in terms of tactical initiatives, and we know what we can do in terms of strategic. So we're clear, whilst also driving forward this war on talent, we're clear how we can get that transformation to be delivered.
Okay, I have a question. Sorry if this is a little bit too far out, I'll pull it back if it's not. But the beginning of COVID, I was trying to help suppliers of PPE find relationships with charities and with partnerships getting it across. And one of the problems was verification of supply for pretty much everybody, because there was so much fraud in the market at the time. And the obvious solution to me that was not scaled out and wasn't a solution then is telepresence.
Yeah.
The relationships that you're talking about, the level of knowledge, the depth that you need to get from the warehouse foreman to the worker and every stage in between. Do you think telepresence is a solution?
Yes, so I think there's that particular challenge of trying to homologate suppliers to onboard suppliers has got lots of things picking through, right? Fundamentally, everyone maintains everyone's master data, right? So everyone's got a customer and everyone's got a supplier, so everyone maintains that data multiple times. So there's some things you can do to do that once. I think telepresence is an answer. I think you need systems like telepresence really early on to understand what some of the challenges are, to understand what the journey looks like, to be able to design it, to be able to get all the components in place, and then I think you're back to the classic. Okay, so how do we update the procedures? How do we modernize the data? So I think it's part of it. It's part of the way to communicate, but it's kind of almost a tool to get to the answer, if you like.
Excellent. You very helpfully built a whole deck about how to design transformation, build consensus and momentum. So I wonder if I could throw some terms at you and let you.
Sure.
Consensus and momentum is the first one.
Yeah. So I think it comes back to this top down, bottom up. Yeah. So how can we get consensus? How can we agree what the priorities are? How can we design, based upon our North Star, what the transformation plan needs to look like? So we're clear about what we need to do around modernizing the systems and around the experience, around the data. And then momentum is about, thinking big, starting small, going fast. It's about building out the initiatives, identifying clear responsibility and accountability. It's about making sure we're clear who's doing everything else, and then finding a way to make transformation a day-to-day activity people do in parallel with what they're doing. Yeah, so it's being clear about the plan, bottom up in detail, and clear about the priorities.
The other end of that, business readiness and gap closure.
Yeah, so I guess if you come back to this transformation program, let's go back to this SAP S4 situation. So we're rolling it. We're trying to modernize our I won't necessarily call it the plumbing, but the enterprise systems that everyone else spins across. Yeah. So how do we update all that? And how do we do that across maybe 30 countries? How can we get to a consistent common design, right? Having identified and prioritized exactly what we're going to change and what we're not going to change, we now need to roll that into 30 odd countries in Europe. Almost all of which you've got acquisitions, almost all of which you've got different entities and different corporates that have been acquired along the way. It's really about making sure enough work's done up front in advance to be able to, if you need to change some supplier arrangements, you need to update some customer contracts, if you need to, solve some data problems in advance, it's understanding that and making sure that happens as part of an orchestrated kind of program plan.
Moments that matter.
Yeah, the moments that matter, if you think about what absolutely really makes a difference. Yeah? So if you're thinking about the supply chain planning process, we need to make a kind of dynamic change to the plan. How can we make sure at that point that we understand the changing customer demand? What does that really mean in terms of its impact on our supply? What is the impact of that on manufacturing? What's the impact of that in terms of purchasing raw materials? It's those business events, 4, 5, or 6, if you like. They almost always align to these kind of critical capabilities and pain points. What are the things that we absolutely have to get right, so that when someone needs to make that decision, and it might be talking to a bottling company now, and it could be about how can the rep who's working in the field make sure that when they're trying to optimize their trade promotions for the particular customer, how can they make sure that the supply chain can follow that through? It's those decisions that unless the systems are right and the experience is right and the data are right, that moment that matter is the thing where real value is lost, top line profit is lost, surety of supply is impacted. They're the things that we're all going to agree are the priorities, and we're going to invest in, exceptional Amazon-like experience.
How much of a role do you think ESG investment is going to play in this model being scaled out?
Well, I kind of talked about this question in terms of the kind of everything else, and then sustainability. I think
maybe what do you mean when you say sustainability? Because everybody has their own.
Yeah,
thing,
it's a good point. Let me just be clear what I mean. And the two things get blurred, right? I'm really talking about. I'm talking about ESG in its widest sense, right? So specifically in supply chain, we're talking about what are our scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, right? So how can we report on our supply chain carbon emissions, and then how can we start to intervene and make different decisions that actually reduce the carbon consumption by our supply chain. But it's only one part of the whole, right? So if you start to think about the carbon emissions, you then start to add on to that. You know, our ESG also includes things like, well, how am I doing in terms of modern slavery when it comes to supply chain? You then start to expand that into, well, what are all the things that, you know, Patagonia, an organization like that, and the B Corp assessment. So how am I contributing towards the job creation? Am I driving development of my local community? Am I using circularity? So I'm kind of, the phrases get blurred, but I really mean, in the short term, the tactical term, how can procurement and supply chain meet their obligations around sustainability reporting? And that starts then to kind of coalesce around how can the whole business report around sustainability across its whole dimensions. Because I believe that, and I'm kind of going off track a little bit,
No.
At the moment we measure an organization's success based upon profitability and likely growth of profitability. Yeah. So we got this arbitrary number called sales, which we adjust based upon accounting principles, and an arbitrary number called costs, which we adjust based upon accounting principles. We calculate profit, we send it to California, right, and then we work out how the rate at which that's going to grow, and then multiply it out, and that's how we assess, you know, taxable profit and value for an organization. I think that's going to change, right? I think it's already changing, yeah? Organizations like Unilever have fundamentally understood that and understand that they need to be able to provide consumer information, and that's going to drive value. So all of these dimensions around ESG reporting in the broadest sense are really the dynamic that is going to change business, as well as reporting success, profitability, taxable profits indeed. Maybe the only hope for preventing our kind of profits heading to California is going to drive a different dynamic. So previously, where it was quite hard to get people in an organization to be able to align around, well, what are the priorities, right? IT are delivering this S4 journey, how on earth can I get A, B, or C done? You've got this dynamic in an organization where there's not consensus. What I'm seeing, talking to my clients, and we've got a conversation this afternoon where we got two consumer businesses in the same room who kind of would think of themselves as competitive historically. I had a life sciences business talking to another consumer business recently to sort of think about what is the dynamic. I think what sustainability and wider ESG is going to start to do is it brings us together. It's going to allow us to agree and align around, actually, you know what, there's literally bigger challenges in the world. You know, the sort of state and success of our social world, of our environmental world, and our political world, and that's starting to drive real collaboration. It's starting to make that consensus easy. So I'm not sure that answered your question.
No, I think you pretty much hit every corner of it, and I think the one that you seem you haven't quite mentioned directly, but it's central to everything that you say, is you talk about a holistic approach and collaboration. We consider, as a group, organizational culture is part of sustainability.
Yeah.
And you touched on it, coalescing around a goal, how to get people to do that, how to get them to kind of achieve things. That seems pretty central to everything that you're describing, is making sure your organizational culture can actually meet the criteria you're setting up in front of it, and all your individual teams have their own culture that are then set up to also achieve that, to report pain points and to solve them.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I'm allowed to talk about age, right? So in this world of equality, but I think we've got kind of old guys like me. Am I that kind of described recently as aged on a podcast, right? So I have to take that. So who might be more historically focused on profit, but with this kind of swathe of kind of younger people who care about more broader things, and that's similarly represented, I think, by our customer base. So we've got quite an interesting dynamic as we need to pivot to be able to make those things kind of align the organizational culture. But I think this wave's coming. I think it really is coming. You can already see it, right? So you can see it's subject to kind of disasters and kind of tragedies like Ukraine. We're already seeing it change in the world, yeah. And the culture is adapting and is changing. And indeed, you know what? There are followed up by obligations to report. So the combination of the right obligations driven by UK government and by EU and other entities, taxation authorities, means that there's a minimum compliance, but it's kind of the wave's coming.
Well, without opening another whole box, talent competition too. But at this point, I want to see, does anybody in the audience have a burning question they want to ask? have some inquisitive looks from the back. I'm going to sort of half open up the floor, so if you want to just raise your hand, Emily will bring you a microphone. But we can kind of continue down this vein for a while. Those online, please submit your questions via the Brella app, and so I can read them out. In your kind of closing thoughts here, you do touch again on investment. So I wonder, when you're looking at this as an investment decision internally, what do we do with excess funds? Business capability, technology, AI, and data, what's the most important one?
Yeah, people. Yeah, so I think it's like saying if you're baking a cake, what's the most important ingredient? Is it the flours? Is it the eggs? Is it the kind of the vanilla you're going to put into it? Is it the butter? It's the right mix at the right time. You know, and the most expensive ingredient might be the vanilla, but putting more vanilla in doesn't necessarily help. So for me, what we're doing with our clients and what I think success looks like is trying to breed that kind of generation of master chefs, people who can understand it is this right mix, and actually things are changing. The oven's hotter, right? To change the analogy, therefore the mix needs to change. You need all of the above, yeah. But you need the right amount, and you need to really focus on them around those differentiated areas, around the moments that matter, around the aspects that are, really do need modernising, around the aspects of focus.
Brilliant. We have a couple of questions now coming in. You mentioned scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions in your supply chain. In the future, do you see yourselves striving to work more closely with B Corps? You mean as in ourselves as in IBM? Or? Yeah, to the degree that you can comment.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of are having this conversation. I think that most of our clients are large corporates, and the dynamic is how can we take the best and most appropriate elements of kind of the B Corp assessments, the kind of what Patagonia do, and help our organisations to apply that at scale, whilst also running their standard business and kind of meeting all the obligations they need to meet. Because B Corps have got an advantage that is starting from scratch. And then, by the way, the focus is amazing. I'm not in any way kind of being dismissive. It's really a case of, taking the right elements of that and applying it to helping our client organisations to be able to be successful. So just, if I can put words in your mouth, less about working with the guys who are already there, but really working with the people that are going to change how the world functions. And actually, do you know what? I think that it's kind of one of my colleagues in the audience talking around the topic of sustainability. Right? She's on later on. We've got a great corporate function that is making all the relevant connections and then assimilating that and translating the whether it be legislation or the latest trends into what we can then apply at scale with our clients. So it's a combination of that. So yes is the answer, but it's really a case of saying, and what's practical. If you are the MOD, right? What's then practical to apply at scale for an organisation like that. We have another question on financing, so I think you're being grilled on this. Yeah. When it comes to investment and financing, is green finance the main route you would look to go down? Yeah, so I mean, I think so. Really, financing is not necessarily my call. But let me just sort of, as in, how do you fund this initiative? But let me just comment on what that means, right? So we are working now with banks, actually using blockchain technology, but the technology is not that important, to help them to understand, if I'm making investment choices, are those investment choices being invested into things that are sustainable, and is that investment continuing to say sustainable? So is it if we've decided to invest into a fund, does that fund continue to be sustainable? So we are doing some of those things. And most of our clients again have got enough scale themselves to be able to invest using their own funding. So I don't really have a green financing point of view. We have a question from the audience. Please introduce yourself and where you work and your title, and go ahead.
My name is Alpesh Doshi. I work for a company called Kendra Labs. The question I have to you is really about the supply chain and ecosystem around Scope 3. So, at the end of the day, Scope 3 is pretty much about an ecosystem and moving data between parties. Given that TCFD and a bunch of other regulations come in with auditable data needed, what's your view on how you build that ecosystem to actually get real data rather than survey data, which is what a lot of the vendors do today, actually get real data feeding into the supply chain and through partners and suppliers into Scope 3?
Yeah, I mean, I briefly touched upon this, kind of this concept of everyone's got their own customer management system and everyone's got their own supply management system. We'll all maintain it lots of times. So if I change my bank account over here as a particular customer or supplier, then someone has to reflect it over there. It's kind of bonkers, the fact that we maintain that data multiple times. Yeah? So firstly, the idea that we can have some way of holding information in one place in a consistent, trusted and reliable way, I think is important. And we have to also be able to trust and assure ourselves that if supplier reports out saying, here's what my Scope 3 numbers look like, that we can rely on it. So it has to be an ecosystem play. It has to be something that scales across, all the different platforms, whether someone's in AWS or Google Cloud or whatever, or IBM Cloud or whatever it might be. So it's definitely about it is an ecosystem play. We have to be able to rely on it. We have to be able to trust it. And we have to also be able to drive some reliable standards that say, here's how I'm going to report on some of those things. Here's how I'm going to consistently define. So I think that's yes, I can see it's really important. And I think I almost like the kind of Google and Apple scenario. I think we'll start to see some standards and some platforms start to prevail to provide this information source.
Fantastic. Bob Booth, thank you so much for joining us. That was a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much.